In this lecture, we are going to practice with the WordPress REST API. Before we start sending requests, we should download an application designed for REST APIs. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a tool called Postman. Postman is a tool for sending API requests. It's a great tool for rapidly prototyping a REST API. Before downloading, you'll need an account. Go ahead with creating an account. It's completely free. There is a premium version of Postman, but the free version will suffice for WordPress development. After creating an account, log into it. I'm going to quickly do so. You will be taken to the dashboard. We can test Postman from the browser, but I prefer the desktop application. It works with local WordPress development, whereas the browser version does not. On the sidebar, there's a link for downloading the desktop application. I want you to download Postman for your system. Next, go through the installation. Installing Postman is like installing any other program. Just keep clicking Next until you've reached the end. I'm going to install Postman for my system. After installing Postman, you may need to log into the application. Once you are logged in, you will be greeted with the same interface from the browser. Like I said before, the difference between the applications is that the desktop app has access to local environments. At the top of the menu, we are going to access the Workspace menu. You may be working on multiple applications. You can create a workspace for each app. This feature will reduce clutter. Let's create a new workspace for our site. The name of our workspace will be called WordPress Udemy. Let's skip the summary. Lastly, we can set the visibility of our workspace. We're on our personal machines, so let's select the personal option. After selecting those options, create the workspace. Initially, the interface may feel overwhelming. However, these tools are beneficial for testing your API. To keep things simple, let's minimize the sidebar. At the bottom left corner, there's a button for closing the sidebar. After closing the sidebar, let's close the Overview tab. This is much simpler. At the top of the application, let's add a new tab. From this tab, we can initiate a new request. We can provide a URL for sending a request. Let's try grabbing a list of posts. In the browser, navigate to the REST API Handbook for WordPress. On the sidebar, let's open the Endpoint Reference menu. We're going to check out the endpoint for posts. There's a wealth of information on this page. Let's learn how to navigate it. From the table of contents, let's check out the first topic called Schema. The Schema topic will describe the type of values you can expect as a response. By requesting a list of posts, WordPress will respond with JSON data. Inside the response, we are going to be provided with various properties related to a post. The Schema section describes each property in detail. For example, the date of the post will be added under a property called Date. Other properties include the ID, title, author, or post type. Not all properties will have a value, but you can expect most of these properties from the response. Let's head back to the table of contents. Through the REST API, we can perform various actions. We can grab a list of posts, create a post, retrieve a single post, update a post, and lastly, delete a post. In each section, we are given the definition, an example request, and a list of arguments. Each subsection is the same. Let's look at an example. I'm going to click on the List Posts section. In the beginning, WordPress will provide a description. According to this description, the following endpoint will provide a collection of posts. Afterward, we are given the definition, which is the endpoint for this action. If you were to comb through the documentation for the definitions of each action, you may notice something. The endpoints are vastly similar to one another. This can feel confusing. How can a single URL handle different actions? It would be the same as having a single URL deliver different images on page refreshes. HTTP is a very powerful protocol for the web. It's not just URLs. We can add additional information to each request. In the documentation, next to the endpoints, you're going to find an HTTP method. For example, grabbing a list of posts is performed with a GET method. Updating a post is performed with a POST method. So, what are HTTP methods? HTTP methods are a category system for describing the type of action that should be performed on a resource. In some cases, we may want to grab a post. In other cases, we may need to update a post. HTTP methods keep our URLs clean. For example, it may be tempting to create an endpoint called getPost. However, what if someone else prefers the name grabPost? In a way, both paths describe the action. This is the wrong way of designing a REST API. This practice would lead to inconsistent naming. There's a better way to write endpoints. The endpoint should describe the resources, not the action. The action can be described with an HTTP method. This naming practice adds clarity and simplicity. There are dozens of HTTP methods. Luckily, we can focus on a handful of them. The most important methods are the following. The GET method is used for retrieving a single or list of resources. The update method is used for creating or updating a resource. Lastly, the delete method is used for deleting a resource. Back to the documentation, the definition should make more sense. The HTTP method for grabbing a list of posts is the GET method. Let's shift our focus to the URL. WordPress will have a special path for its REST APIs. In this case, we can grab a list of posts by visiting the wp/v2/posts endpoint. This endpoint can be appended after the URL of a WordPress site. The next section has an example of what a request would look like. It's very self-explanatory. Lastly, we have a section with a list of arguments. As I said before, REST APIs allow us to send and receive data. We can filter the list of posts returned by WordPress by sending arguments. For example, we can limit the number of posts returned by adding the per-page argument. By default, this argument is set to 10. Let's try using this endpoint. Switch over to Postman. In the address bar, type the following URL: udemy.local/wp.json/wp/v2/posts. Your server should be running for this request to work. Let's examine the URL before initiating the request. WordPress will reserve a unique path for the REST API. All paths must begin with wp.json. It doesn't matter if the endpoint is part of the core or a custom endpoint. Afterward, we can append the endpoint. To the left, we can change the HTTP method. By default, the method has been set to GET. As I mentioned before, there are dozens of HTTP methods. However, in relation to WordPress, the most commonly used methods are GET, POST, and DELETE. Let's initiate the request. After doing so, the bottom of the application should display the data received by the server. As you can see, WordPress will provide a list of posts with JSON. The number of posts may be limited. We can customize the posts returned by adding an argument. Arguments can be added through query parameters. Conveniently, Postman provides a section for adding query parameters. For example, let's try adding the per-page argument. The value for this argument will be 2. As for the description, we can safely ignore this field. Postman provides this field for adding a description for your teammates who may not know what the query parameter is for. After filling out the form, let's resubmit the request. This time, 2 objects will appear from the response. As you can see, we can grab data from WordPress. We're going to be using the REST API for registering and logging in. Let's begin that process in the next lecture.